It is time again for Natural 2, our unscripted tabletop talk show. I am James, he is Nathan, and you are lovely for watching and listening. This week, what are we talking about, Nathan?
We are discussing the hopefully insightful topic of resurrection, reviving, life and death in D&D 5e specifically, and potentially how to fix that or address it or adjust it for your group or game.
That's right, it's a matter of life and death this week on Natural 2.
So, to kick it all off, I imagine the most apt way of starting is just describing the various ways that you might go about reviving a dead party member or potentially a favorite NPC of some sort. The one that I'm sure everybody's familiar with, since I imagine most people play low-level D&D for the most part, is Revivify, which is kind of, I've been reading into it. Most people refer to it as the shock paddles of D&D. Revivify is a level 3 spell, and it basically is only useful in a combat scenario. It has a 1-minute timer from when the person dies to when you can cast the spell. It's instantaneous, requires a 300 gold piece diamond, and is relatively obtainable for your average adventuring party. And I think that right there is the keystone to why a lot of people have issues with it or find it obnoxious that any reasonable adventuring group can go secure some diamonds and then have that ready, or somewhat in our case, in our game, tag along an NPC that knows Revivify and just keep her in the background as a defibrillator and wait until someone goes down.
I feel like it's the least offensive or the least controversial of the spells because it
Mhm.
does have a strict time frame. Like if you don't get to it within the encounter, your moment is past. The opportunity is gone. So it's easy for me to suspend my disbelief and not to think of that character as dead, to think of it as sort of the CPR spell. And if you're running a grittier campaign or you want the stakes to be higher, then you can pretty easily deny the 300 gold piece diamonds or just give a limited amount as treasure, and no store that they ever visit ever has any for sale.
Yeah, that's going to be one of the big topics we cover, kind of at our advice part of this conversation, where how you can adjust resources and acquisition and make these things a bit more difficult for your party to obtain. I will say that Revivify is one of the spells I have the most issues with and would almost recommend entirely removing it from your game, but we will get into that later, I'm sure. The next one on the totem pole is Raise Dead, which is within a 10-day period. It is a ritual, it's a 1-hour cast, 500 gold piece diamond, and the body must be relatively intact, which I actually think is a point that not a lot of people consider or use in this scenario, where if a party member is struck down dead, he probably isn't just laying there perfectly intact with no wounds. It would make sense that an arm is missing or there's a hole in his stomach, and then if that's the case, these lower level resurrection spells would not apply.
I also think this is what the spell Gentle Repose is almost meant for.
Mhm.
This is the use case. This is the combo. Gentle Repose because you didn't get to Revivify in time.
Next we have Reincarnate, which is again another 1-hour ritual, and we have bumped it up to now 1,000 gold pieces with that 10-day time frame yet again.
Reincarnate is my least favorite. If I were going to get rid of one or ban one, it would
Mhm.
be Reincarnate because that is asking for
Shen-
shenanigans.
Shenanigans was the term I was going to use, yeah.
It couldn't be much worse if the spell said that they come back with a clown nose and giant red shoes. You're inviting the rest of the night and maybe the next several nights to be derailed by, oh, you're a gnome now and you were a Goliath. Oh, how funny is that?
Yeah, I enjoy the flavor of it. I like that it's included. It's also very specifically removed from being like a cleric or a divine spell and more of a druid kind of nature spirit side. So I think if anything, I would try to adjust the kind of dopey comical side of it and keep it. Though I do see the frustrating aspect of it. If the group was mature enough to handle it, I think it'd be really interesting to explore. But more often than not, it's going to turn into some gag that gets ran over quite a few times.
I feel like there are ways to reflavor Reincarnate, or take away the D100 table and
Mhm.
institute your own consequences for reincarnation.
Yeah. Or they have to find a body to offer up. That would be an interesting little quest or like thing.
Yeah, there's almost any number of ways to make it more interesting than it is. Like
Yeah.
I feel like this is something from a net hack or text-based, dungeon crawling computer game where just wacky things are happening.
But moving past Reincarnate back into our kind of traditional, almost religious, divine intervention revivals, we have Resurrection, which is, I guess, the most mid-tier, middle ground, like cut and dry process. It has a certain time limit. I think it's a year. It's 1,000 gold pieces. It restores missing body parts, and it's a 7th level spell. I think the main comments I have about this one is I enjoy it being in the game. I enjoy that level of magic being in the game. I think it all comes down to how readily available it is. And usually the way that I try and contextualize this when thinking about a world or world building is if this is in your world and this is in your game, and it's only 1,000 gold pieces, why isn't every rich person in the universe have a resurrection slave on hand? Why aren't they just like dragging around these clerics that are ready to just pop them back into existence? The main way I would try and adjust or homebrew this spell is figuring out why it can't just be constantly abused. It's not just something that you can pop down to the 7-Eleven in your fantasy town and get resurrected. But it is, I think, key to the game. So I would never fully remove it.
We'll get into. I have a lot of thoughts when we get into the sort of the philosophy around these spells, but I think that it's good to have in emergencies, especially at that high of a level, because the level of investment that a player might have in their character at that point, losing their character could really hurt their level of enthusiasm
They
for
might
the
leave
game.
the game. And if it's at that point, then
Yeah, it's not unheard of.
yeah.
It's not unheard of for that to happen. So having that there to keep things moving as a hedge against a phenomenally bad combination of dice rolls, which
Mm-hmm.
also has been known to happen,
Mm-hmm.
is just too valuable, I think.
So finally, before we get into like really fringe stuff, which I'm just going to gloss over pretty quickly, True Resurrection is one of those spells that's included in the game where you could build an entire campaign around just casting this spell, getting the money for it, getting the experience for it, or finding an NPC powerful enough to do it so you can bring back some ancient hero or god or something of that sort.
I've seen other discussions that talk about spells that you could build quests and campaigns around, and most of the high level spells you can imagine that situation. This one absolutely could be the end point of a campaign
Mhm.
or a high level quest reward.
It would be the only spell that I kind of referred to earlier, where if the players got so fixated on it's in the book, it's there, I can use it, that they start derailing the campaign to focus only on that. That would be the only issue I would see about just kind of including it no matter what or not worrying about it, is it might come down to that. And of course, if you have a decent relationship with your players, you can just say, hey, we're not doing this, or if we are going to do this, let's actually work together on it. But I could see some DMs getting frustrated that like they have this expertly crafted story that they're halfway through and then a character dies and now all the attention is on bringing them back versus finishing the story. That's probably the only downside I would see with this.
That kind of problem is part of the DM's burden. That's
Okay.
it's kind of what we've signed up for
Yeah,
as a
I,
group.
I agree to that to an extent, but it's one of those things where if you can remove the problem before it happens, not too bad. That is, so after that, you have like Wish and cloning, and there's a few other ones that I saw people referring to. But realistically, those are probably not going to come up, probably more rare than even True Resurrection to some extent, unless, of course, it's like what your campaign is built around or a player is like specifically going after it. So that's outside the scope of this conversation. Perhaps that will be a topic down the road. For now, we are just focusing on the kind of cut and dry, I revive you with spell X or Y, and discussing how to make that a bit more dramatic, story-driven, impactful. You know, those fun little words. I think most people are going to be worried about it being abused and how to stop abusing it, or having it be more of an event than it is. One of the prominent points that I caught on to when doing a bunch of research and watching other people's videos on this, that there's a ton of systems in the game for various things. There's a whole system for death when you go unconscious and doing the death saving throws. There's, all these systems in place for grappling and going prone and all this fun stuff. But there isn't a system for being revived, which you would argue is a lot more suspenseful and dramatic and impactful than these other kind of mundane surface level systems. So a lot of people recommend making a homebrew system for it, which I think is ultimately going to be kind of my recommendation at the end. So I think that's probably where we should start, is how to make Resurrection in general more impactful to your game, whether it's story driven or a more like dungeon crawl adventuring campaign.
So for me, I want to start out my side of this conversation by talking about just what I prefer. And that is for death in the campaign world to be sort of like, let's say, Diablo. It's super important to everybody except kind of your character, but nobody talks about it. We don't talk about hit points, in character. We don't shine a light on that. We don't talk about levels of exhaustion. Nobody comes into a tavern and says, "Gosh, I'm 3 levels of exhaustion. I need a room right now." There are certain things that we just sort of accept as being a part of the game, and that we don't get arsed about trying to justify or talk about in an in-character way. It's sort of like whenever if you play Metal Gear Solid, you're playing a video game, and the character in the video game tells you to press the action button. I hate that crap. I hate it. It's goofy. And I feel like this is very, very much in the same kind of category. Let's not poke at it. Let's not shine a real bright light on it. Let's not spend hours and hours going on and on and on about it, because I feel like that does more to cheapen it for me than it does to make it impactful. I want to put it just kind of in the background as a way to save a player character specifically, going poof and ruining that player's experience. But if it exists in no other context, I think that is a-okay. If you die out in the field, your character pops up in town. Does anybody in town say, "Holy hell, where did you come from?" No, they don't. Deckard Cain is killed, spoilers. Does he pop back up in town? No, he doesn't. Do we ever wonder why? No, we don't.
I think I would take a rather different stance from you. The way that I approach death or think about death, or how I would prefer it, I think that's how we're kind of phrasing this, is what is our optimal setup to have the best game or the best system for revival and death in D&D, or at least in 5e. Immersion is everything to me. And again, this is coming from the DM side, where world building and a lot of the other external aspects of the consequences of having these systems matter. Like, I have to worry about, again, why the king doesn't abuse this, or why villains don't just keep constantly returning. And if the answer to you is as simple as, the party is blessed by this specific god that allows them to do this and no one else can, sure. It's a perfectly fine way of justifying it, keeping your immersion and keeping the system relatively loose. But in a world where you want to keep it available to everyone and have this realistic is the wrong term to use here, but believable world to play around in, where this bringing back people from death exists, I would start stripping it down so that not only death as a game mechanic and as a story beat matter, but so the world itself feels more, again, believable or weighty. I would almost kind of start getting the effect, if players kept going down and dying and being brought back over and over again, of some like kid show villain that gets blasted off into the sky, and then 3 episodes later they're like, "Aha, I'm back." And it's like, oh, okay. That would be how I kind of feel in the opposite spectrum, where the heroes just keep getting killed. There's like, oh, hobbits go on, I've been shot 4 times. And it's like, boink, get up. And it's like, oh, okay, well, let's go toss the ring in. Like, that's where I start getting lost and I kind of start having fun with it. It is notable to go out of your way to do this or prepare for this or to bring someone back to the point that them dying is a genuine inconvenience. Because that's what death should be in a game. Punishment isn't a word I would use a bunch with how a game should be run, but if you do the wrong things or if the dice aren't in your favor, there should be consequences to those actions. There should be death or the risk of permanent loss. Because if there isn't, you start chipping away at the suspension of disbelief. And I think that's kind of where I butt heads a little bit with just kind of hand waving it away and being like, well, if they want their character back, let them have it. It's like, well, damn, am I running the game anymore or are they running the game?
Well, that was never in question. The players are running the game.
That is true.
I think what I should add is that I'm the kind of player that will leave a character dead because I don't want it to become goofy. Sort of try to have it both ways, I guess. It hurts my immersion to focus too much on the resurrection spells, and I would rather just do it and then kind of pretend it didn't happen, or sort of... That's why I don't have a problem with Revivify, is because it's easy to rationalize, like, they weren't dead. They were dying. You brought them right back up there, so that happens in modern real life, quote unquote real life hospital dramas, right?
Mhm.
Like, oh, he's been dead for 3 minutes, but then they bring him back. So he wasn't dead. So that's why I don't have a problem with Revivify, because I can make that make sense in my own head, in my head canon. But I also have it's going to sound like I'm really complimenting myself here, and that's not what I intend. But
No, that's what we're here for.
I have the discipline as a player to volunteer not to take the option, even if it is available, because I don't want it to become a joke. And I think that is, I would encourage other players to sort of think about that, mentally prepare for that possibility. I have had a character where had a freak bad combination of dice rolls, and he just fell off a cliff and died. And it was kind of silly. And so we brought him back. But I was talking to the DM at that time later on, and I said, the next time that he goes down, I'm not going to agree to be brought back. Because I don't want it to become a gag. Players, you should also take some responsibility for the tone of your game and for the believability and for the immersion. Don't leave all that up to the DM. You should take some responsibility and accept a consequence if it feels right. Give something to reinforce what your campaign is.
All of this advice and our opinions is all well and good, but the genuine way to approach this problem, or to try and solve the problem if you're already having it, is discussing it with your group. We have ragged on communication multiple times and how essential it is for a healthy group to communicate with one another, that have the same expectations. Ideally, in session 0, or even before session 0 when you're gathering players up, you have a very lengthy conversation with them about, do you actually want your characters to die? If not, what kind of theme are we going for? If you are down for them to die, how strict do you want that to be? How often do you want that to be? And then you can start discussing the setting that you're going into, or the experience that you're looking to play. And that should guide how you treat resurrection in your game basically all the way through. If your players are going to throw a fit if they die, then just let them have it. And yeah, if you're a DM who doesn't enjoy that, it's going to suck for you, but that is a better alternative than basically abusing your players because you want it a certain way. That would be the point that I would kind of start this off on, is know your setting, know your players, know what theme you're going for, and then adjust it all to fit that.
Diamonds at every level of resurrection that are consumed by the spell. That is your invitation to throttle access to these spells. There's no reason, like, just because your party happens to have 25,000 gold doesn't mean that they are automatically able to find the diamonds that they need to cast True Resurrection. It would be totally fair play that there is no store in your world that carries diamonds.
Or
If you want
diamonds of that,
diamonds,
yeah, rarity.
yeah, you have to find them. Maybe you find them as treasure, or there's a rumor that you have to investigate of somebody that knows where diamonds are. That's the built-in way to keep it from getting ridiculous.
Instead of doing diamonds, you can make the material component whatever you want. And this might be somewhat similar to soul gems in the kind of Elder Scrolls universe, but you have like lesser soul gems and greater soul gems, and you can keep upping it and upping it. Or you can have actual leveled materials where you have like a level 11 soul gem, and you can only revive, people of that level with a soul gem that matches. And then that way, you have a very cut and dry way of, oh, you guys are level 15 now. I don't want you going around just reviving all the time. You gotta go get a level 15 resurrection gem. Now you can make a whole quest around it. If the party really wants to prepare for that or seek it out, then that's a thing versus, going down to the store, buying 1,000 gold worth of diamonds and going down the road. So that was something cool that I thought some people might want to apply.
That's a good way of doing it. You can also consider that the gem has to be filled.
Yeah.
So who are you going to kill in order to bring back your fellow party member? When you're talking True Resurrection or Resurrection, even True Resurrection, especially like a diamond that costs 25,000 gold pieces. You did the math not long ago. We had a conversation about how gold pieces translate to
Yeah, when we find that.
real world money, just roughly. Obviously it's not like 110% scientific, so don't flame us about it.
1 gold piece is about $50, roughly. It's very rough. So that is $1,250,000, roughly US dollars, if you're doing that conversion, which is an insane amount of money, or a diamond worth that amount of money.
So yeah, in our world, a diamond that is one diamond, or even a collection of diamonds that is worth more than $1 million, that's not a diamond. That's a diamond that has a name. That's like the Hope Diamond or the Czarina's Diamond or something like that. So there's another idea right there for your campaign. There is a diamond.
And it's consumed.
That and it is consumed that is capable of being used to cast this spell.
Yeah.
And the king has it in his crown, or the black dragon is sitting on it, or whatever.
Or it's in like a different plane of existence.
The sky's the limit with that stuff.
Revivify. How exactly would you change it for your perfect game?
I don't have a problem with Revivify. It's a low level spell, and it's there to cover oopsies. You have the spell prepared, you have the diamonds ready. You have put in the forethought for this exact scenario. The use case is very specific. So I really don't think I would change it. If you're worried about Revivify becoming a problem, then there again, you can restrict the access to those diamonds. If you've got a cleric that is carrying around a sack full of diamonds, then that is a target for thieves and pickpockets. There's ways to keep it interesting, but I don't have a problem with the spell, really.
I would approach changing it in 2 different ways. Either simply removing it, which I don't think hurts the game, but isn't really a creative way. The way that I would actually try and fit it in and make it more interesting, I would probably lower the time limit on it, where in the game it's a minute, so that's 10 rounds of combat. I would lower it down to like 1 or 2, and then remove the cost or restrictions of it. Make it an actual like last resort paddle versus like a spell that actually brings someone back from the dead. I would more reskin it than change it all that much, because I think it is used more as like a paddle that just brings someone back who just died, and I would make that more strict so that it feels more suspenseful when you're doing it. I only have 1 round to get there, or I need someone to throw me his body so I have enough movement to get there, versus, I still have 8 rounds. We'll finish this combat, then I'll pick him up. That's usually how I see Revivify used, where I think it would be a lot more interesting of like, oh shit, I have to either do with the damage, or remove this buff, or bring my ally back. I'm gonna go bring my ally back, because decision making and drama and suspense is like the shit that I thrive off of. And if you can incorporate that into Revivify, making it more interesting than just, let's finish this bad guy off because there's no way you're going more than 10 rounds of combat in D&D 5e, let's be real. That would be more interesting to me. That's how I would change it, besides just removing it entirely.
As a counterpoint, I think that another way you could raise the drama or the suspense would be to lean into the player's abilities to cast it by making the bad guys do finishing blows. Most of the time, I think the way most people play combat is when a character is incapacitated and making death saves, the bad guys move on from them. You could have particularly vicious enemies that go for that confirmed kill. The supply of 300 gold diamonds is suddenly way more important, and the ability to cast Revivify and how many times you can becomes something to manage a lot more.
Raised Dead. I feel like I don't have a ton of comments on Raised Dead.
I also don't have any changes to make to this. I think having the Raised Dead sickness is an interesting wrinkle that makes it more believable somehow.
I'll just hop right into Resurrection then. Well, there's Reincarnation that I think we've already kind of covered. It's pretty goofy. There's ways of solving that or reducing the goofiness.
Take away the random table, and which for some people is the fun of the spell. And there again, communication is key. But I would want to take away the random table and provide a body or construct a body.
Offer a body, like another player character, or something.
Or since it is a druid spell, then this gives you an opportunity to again get creative, and maybe the character that is reincarnated is green or has leaves in their hair now, or has some other marking that shows that they are not just a regular whatever they are anymore.
So I think a lot of my opinion is going to come out with Resurrection. At least still from my perspective, that is like the pure middle ground of this conversation. It's kind of past Revivify, that's kind of used as a paddle. It's below true Resurrection, which is this kind of almost ungodly, unachievable thing. Resurrection is probably, beside Revivify, one of the spells that I could see DMs having problems with incorporating into their world and also having fun with overall at the table. Being revived is rather traumatic, and Raised Dead touches on this in a very surface level way. That penalty that gets removed by long rests, no one's really going to care unless you're actively in a dungeon, which means you're probably not casting Raised Dead anyway. That penalty is just going to get downtimed away. Not going to really come into the game. So I would do something along the lines with Resurrection of they're out for weeks or months, or their abilities just are not where they used to be. It might change their personality or their alignment. It should be a permanent shift that is noticeable down the road, or at least something that takes a lengthy time to remove, because that's more interesting, not only in like a story sense, but it keeps that threat of dying there. You don't want to die because you might come back not as good or not as powerful or losing a certain ability. And I could certainly see on a player's side being like, oh no, we are not incorporating that in our game whatsoever. I don't want you touching my character sheet or doing anything like that. I think that's almost the reaction I want when talking about death and resurrection is, if you get resurrected, if you go down and die, which is the ultimate, I messed up and I found myself in this situation, there should be some consequence for that. I think that's where most of my opinions on revival and D&D come from, and I think is a huge wasted opportunity to incorporate this and keep it cool and interesting, but also keep death relevant, so it's not just, oh, I'm dead, oh, I'm up, oh, I'm dead, oh, I'm up. That's my broad introduction to that, which is kind of rambly.
I think it's also worth thinking about the player characters are going down that often, so as to make revival seem silly, then maybe the combats need to be retuned. That goes back to the discussion of what kind of game do you have, and maybe the players are going down too often through not entirely fault of their own.
A lot of the problem that I saw was this kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Someone would put a post out, oh, my characters are dying all the time, and they just keep reviving, I don't know what to do, and everything's kind of a mess, and I'm tired of trying to deal with this, what should I do? And someone says, all right, here's what you should do. Either, adjust your combat, or, adjust Revivify or Resurrection in general, and they go and they do that thing. Then some other issue pops up where the player falls into a trap and dies and doesn't really care because he knows that he can just get dragged out and pulled back. Ultimately, what it comes down to, because it just keeps kind of going back and forth of like, yeah, I've solved this one issue where my combat is no longer incredibly difficult, but now they're just running face first into traps and not giving a shit. And it's like, all right, well then I'll stop making my traps deadly. And eventually at the end of this road, someone has this post. It's like, my game has no consequences anymore. My world is shattered. The quests don't make any sense. And my players are just all a bunch of jokes. Like, that's like the end of this road. And again, the solution to all of this is communication. But to not just use that kind of scapegoat blanket band-aid, you have to have a firm idea of what life and death looks like in your world. And again, this is kind of that session 0 conversation that we talked about, where your players should understand what life and death look like in this world. And if you have players, and you should know this, that are going to abuse some sort of resurrection or make it a joke or rely on it all the time, talk to them about it, adjust it, or change groups. That's kind of something that I don't think people recommend enough. If you really want something and the party you're playing with wants something else, nothing is going to fix that if it just keeps popping up as an issue.
There are some things that you'll never be able to make enough tweaks or home house rules to ultimately fix. And I think that on some level you have to agree or at least overlap as a group with what life and death and the nature of them are in your campaign world. I have seen advice elsewhere. I feel funny about name dropping. I want to give credit where it's due, but I also don't want to be weird about dropping names. Let's just say that I didn't come up with this on my own. It is more than acceptable for there to be magic and classes and abilities aren't in the books, but are in your world, or that are not available to the player characters, but are in your world. I think that the resurrection spells are an opportunity to at least consider that maybe this is an instance where it is available to the player characters and nobody else. Because this is a thread that once you start pulling it, it can unravel the whole campaign. Because if the bad guys have access to these spells, especially at high levels, then the campaign can't end. No problem will ever be solved for
sounds
good.
Oddly familiar to something we're currently facing in our campaign.
Yeah. No problem will be solved for all and for good as long as the bad guys have these spells. So there again, it's a tricky situation. Once you start thinking too hard about it or really start pulling that thread, you've got a problem. So it's worth considering also that this might be something that for some reason is really only available to the players. If an NPC dies, they're dead. Or if the member of the party who has the spell goes down, there is not an NPC cleric that knows it. That also is a potentially interesting wrinkle for your players to have to deal with. Or that there's something about the player characters that makes it possible that is not true for every being in your campaign world. It could be that Revivify or Resurrection doesn't work on NPCs. Your player characters have been touched in some way, so it only works on them. Again, we not to hand wave away a discussion that we're supposed to be having and is the purpose of this episode. Be creative, and I hope that we're giving you some of those ideas and starting point.
I think that's a really important thing to touch on, is that so many people approach problems in D&D as, oh, the rules say this, and I am having so much difficulty enforcing them or adjusting to them or playing with them. I feel like it's common sense to just go, okay, this is broken, let's fix it, however way that works. But there's so many like posts or, requests for advice on, I can't stand Sentinel anymore. I hate Sentinel. How do I fix it? And it's like, well, fix it. Like, flavor it. Find some way around it. Talk to your players about it. And that's kind of what you mostly recommended there. Is this is a very easy way to explain away a problem that so many people would have, or at least more DM world builders might have.
The Dungeon Master's Guide. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can put it on the screen if we can find it.
I know exactly what you're about to say.
It says that the DM has the power. It says that the DM can make rulings, and those rulings are the rules. Newer DMs or inexperienced DMs don't seem to be entirely comfortable with. And I'm not a big believer in homebrewing a game to death or house ruling a game to death. I like to follow the recipe first and see how it tastes and then make changes.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great way to solve a problem in a game that is ongoing. Because I think the trap that you fall into when you're talking about how to change revival spells or anything else is once the game has started, everybody's kind of agreed. And if something is taken away while the game is in progress, that's when it feels the worst. That's when the player feels like they have been robbed.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that makes Session 0 so important is Session 0 is your chance to change it. Because once the game is in progress, you're going to have to be a lot more careful about how you go about it. But if it's a kind of bad guy, if it's something that they can prepare for or that they can see coming, and it's not just suddenly that their tool is gone from the box, never to return, feels better to me.
Mm-hmm.
And to bring it back to revival mechanics, you could make it a condition of the game if you wanted to. Maybe while we're on the Shadowfell, none of the resurrection spells work.
Mm-hmm.
Or the big bad evil guy performed a ritual that has placed a barrier in the celestial plane.
Mm-hmm.
And so now death is only one way until you solve that problem.
I love those ideas, but I would put forth that you should talk about this with your players beforehand and not just implement these things randomly. Because if you walk up to a session one day, you're like, the apocalypse just happened up in heaven and revival no longer works. They're going to be like, thanks. So this is most popular in Critical Role, the Matt Mercer kind of rule set for Resurrection. And I say that just so everyone's kind of on the same page. It is applied a lot more broadly to other people. And of course, people have taken that system and put it in their own game and twisted it, which is what I would recommend you do if you are interested in this system. Very basic explanation of what it is whenever you bring someone back to life, it isn't just, I cast a spell and it succeeds. It is a lot more like casting a spell on a bad guy or like a utility spell where there is a saving throw or a mechanic involved. And what it basically boils down to is there's the modifiers of friends and allies kind of calling them back or offering up little connections that they have, or even negative penalties like how long they've been dead or how they died or what type of person they are or how many times they've been dead or brought back. That's probably one of the, I think, most useful bits of information or tips from this little homebrew system is if you have problems with your characters just getting brought back all the time, start giving them penalties for being brought back over and over and over again. But to get back to the actual explanation, it all comes down to a DC. It comes down to beating a number with your dice, with all these various modifiers applied, which is the core of D&D, in my opinion, is probably my favorite way of approaching fixing death, or making death more impactful, or more of like a story beat. Because I much more enjoy the story of D&D versus the mechanics of it, or the combat of it, or the magical items. I'm here for the characters, and death is such a strange concept, or cool is probably not the right term to use, but an interesting concept to play around with and see applied to these characters that you're role-playing as. And I think that system brings that to life. Well, that's actually a horrible term to use here, but puts a really cool spotlight on an otherwise bland moment of I succeed. Instead, it's, oh man, or is this enough? Do you have anything? Oh well, I'll do this. I'll pray to my deity and see if that she'll come in and help. And everyone's like invested in this moment and bringing their person back. And then when you get that success, which I would say you'd want to set it up so it's usually successful with a very slim chance of failure. So when they do succeed, there's this genuine relief, this actual excitement, this flavor of victory that they didn't lose their companion. That would be the system that I would broadly recommend, or at least something to look at if you're interested in kind of applying some different rules to death and revival.
I'm glad that you're bringing up the critical role method,
Mhm.
because here's my hot take. That is the dumbest.
Ah,
The dumbest
no,
crap. I
no.
hate it. I the idea that it's a DC with penalties and buffs, that's okay. That's not the thing that I have the most trouble with. What I hate, this is kind of what I was talking about at the top of the episode, and where my immersion, like my approach to what is immersive or what helps and hurts my suspension of disbelief, is kind of inside out in revival and resurrection spells versus almost everything else in the game. Being choosy about when to make it a thing and when to shine a light on it. The DC is fine, the penalties and the buffs is fine. The idea that the party, that this person's friends are calling them back, turns every time that you go down in combat into a Days of Our Lives hospital bed monologue, and it's the dumbest crap.
Oh, I disagree with you so hard.
I hate it. It's goofy. It's, it turns it into a melodrama. And especially, like, that works once. If it's the third or fourth time that somebody's gone down and the party's gathering around them, like, oh man, you should like totally come back to life. We're gonna get pizza later, and we can put pineapple on it, and I won't even make fun of you. And let's see, the next town that we're going to is Mardi Gras this time of year, and you don't want to miss that. So you should totally come back. And I don't know, DM, do I have the +2 yet? I can't think of anything else. Like, it's shit. It's shit.
What I would say, from my perspective, is you're doing the too much of a good thing turns bad. Where if you take anything and go to the harshest extreme of its use case, it just looks ridiculous. In any D&D game, if you give death weight, and then it just happens all the time, you're already subtracting from that weight, you're already subtracting from the impact it has on the story. So this mechanic is built for games where death is not every episode or every 2 episodes. It is an impactful thing, and that's the point of the flavor that you are bringing in, the system that you're bringing in, where yes, it could easily devolve into like, oh, all the adventures that we've had together, don't you remember that time in the prancing pony? I could see how that could get obnoxious to some people, but that's not something you have to include with this system. That's something that they dive into a lot because it's a show and they kind of have this whole back and forth going. It could just be as simple as, hey DM, can I roll a religion check to have my deity like shine a spotlight on this for a little bit? And that could be it. That could literally be your contribution. It's really up to, again, your party and group's approach to things on how dramatic this event can be. So I somewhat agree with you that it can get obnoxious if beaten over the head with, but I would not say that it is a bad approach.
That's the change that I would make to the change that you would make, is find other less time-consuming ways to resolve that roll against that DC.
Okay, well, let me give you a little thought experiment here, because I find this interesting. And maybe we'll cut this, but who knows. Let's say Valorant dies. And for those of you who are unaware, Valorant is his character that we have in our long-term D&D campaign, his Million Adventures. Check us out. Valorant dies. Heroic death, but you, James, as the player, are not ready to let go of him, and the group as well are working to get him back. Would it not be way more interesting as that player to see the group come together and, Thor has some small dialogue about how you're best friends and you've been through so much and you feel that connection, that genuine connection with only the player and his character, and then Decker comes up and he's like, we butt heads and we don't approach things the same way, but I don't know what to do without you. Like, isn't that way more interesting than Roll, roll, roll. Okay, you're back. Like that would be my argument.
I would have to think about it because I almost feel like my expectation for that scene is so low that I would just stay dead and just come up with a new character in order to avoid going through that. Which is probably not
Mhm.
totally fair of me, but I just have a really bad taste in my mouth for that for some reason. That goes back to a previous point where you as a player need to also decide how you're going to keep it from getting ridiculous and
Mhm.
when it's time for your character to decline to be
Yeah.
resurrected.
I mean, the alternative, another like thing to put forward is they could go through this whole spiel, and if Thor starts like goofing off or it becomes like sticking pickles up Valoran's dead nose or something, you're like, he's not coming back. We're good. That's an accurate way of
That's
handling that situation.
yeah, just that's
Yeah.
what I think of your madcap hijinks.
So I think overall, what I would say to your apprehension to the critical role style of resurrection, you have to balance it correctly. Everything about D&D is balancing how much you include, how much you delve into things, how much attention you give certain aspects. So you can apply it with as much of a magnifying glass or as little as a spotlight as you want. Let it fit your group, but I think it's a useful tool and a cool concept and an interesting mechanic.
I agree with that actually. It's worth thinking about and it's worth uh remembering as an option if this is a corner of the game that's giving you fits.
But that's all I have for revival and resurrection and all the problems that may arise from it in D&D 5e.
And me as well. I hope that you will subscribe, hit the like, hit the bell, all of that good stuff. Whether you enjoyed it or not, frankly, a lot of people say, "Oh, if you liked it, hit the bell." I hit it either way is what I say. But if you liked it, you got no reason not to.
I, for one, dear viewer, only want you to hit the like button if you genuinely got something out of it. Check out our campaign if you're interested. That's been going on for quite some time, a year and a half now, getting close to 2 years every single week. And check out the other content on the channel, map making and advice and discussions and all that fun stuff coming up.
Is it too early to say that the anniversary is going to be a little special?
I mean, yeah, if anyone's watching at this point, I don't think it's too much of a surprise. Do you want to discuss it, sir?
No, I don't. I just want to leave that little tease there and stay tuned. Keep it here for a very special episode coming
Yep.
up
Episode
in
50.
just a few weeks.
But that about does it.
Until next time.